Nelson's book practically demands that the reader begin making connections between the text and the world outside through its use of snapshots. The images that are included in Carver, A Life in Poems, that show artifacts from different museum collections, different library collections from Carver's life. So, for example, there's a photograph of Carver standing next to his painting Yucca and Cactus, which won honorable mention at the Chicago World's Fair. That gives context for A Charmed Life, like direct context, because it's talking about, among other things, painting that picture. That poem about painting the picture. So there's this sort of one-to-one link there. Other photographs of things that are like artifacts sort of have a more ambiguous connection and perhaps invite the viewer to wonder. So when we see, say, dried plant specimens or his crocheting and his needlework, we think more broadly about how is this image related to the poem I just read? How are these eyeglasses that Carver wore related to this poem where he's described as sitting and reading and contemplating? What role would those glasses have played in it, even if they weren't mentioned in the poem itself? Kind of like we have this specimen here that is in the Carver collection kept with the USDA because he made so many contributions to our understanding of food science. Laid the groundwork for it literally with the things he was doing in the 1890s and at the turn of the century. So, on that note, how do we build on this? How do we create activities? I made here a possible library activity. And this is the kind of activity I would make. But one of the reasons I would make it is that I have these resources. So activities do depend on what resources are available. Yeah, I like 19th century stuff. So I've got 19th century things like not only just yarn and crocheting needles, which are very modern, but the shuttles that would have been used to weave the carding combs from the 19th century, things like that. I like old stuff. So I could take that sort of stuff and I could take also resources, say, at the Lincoln Library or the Arts in the Gap program and bring them together and make something like this. So keep all of that in mind as you're looking at what sort of activity. And also realize that as you are thinking about activities, you could think about potential resources that you could use that maybe you wouldn't normally have available, say, just for a class project. So this is also assumes that a library summer reading program would have some funds for like prizes or materials or stuff like that, which again is not always the case. But here's the context. We have a summer reading program at a local library, and this is included on the list for students, and it should have age-appropriate listings. It should probably also have some content warnings so that parents are aware of the language and the very real, very heavy historical reality that's tied to some of these award-winning poems. And I think these poems are so readable that it would be excellent for an open mic. But again, if you're doing it at a public library, you may want to navigate this by, say, having an edited version that does not include things like the N-word. Because it's one thing to read that, it's quite another to hear it out loud, especially in the mouth of a child at an open mic. So those are kinds of decisions that you could put in notes in activities that maybe you would consider as part of this multi-layered process that goes into planning activities with books. So that's just activity number one. Then, what do? You've had an open mic where students get to experience the poems. Now let's get hands-on. So I would have an in-person craft. I would bring in late 19th century artifacts that deal with textiles, specifically because there's several discussions of textiles or implicit discussions of textiles, like not only is it in his crocheting, but also in the discovery of Egyptian blue, or what we might call cobalt blue today, a color that hadn't been seen since the time of King Tut in Egypt. So thinking about that, then you could get kids to actually interact with textiles. You could have someone teaching crocheting. Knitting needles and yarn are relatively inexpensive, and a very basic crocheting stitch could easily be taught to early middle school, maybe even late elementary school students who would be included in the readership for a kind of book like this. What else could you do? Maybe for younger students, because it also goes into lower elementary classes. Well, you could do something like felting. Because felting is something that even little kids could do because it doesn't involve these sort of intricacies of the hook and the yarn and creating those knots, which can be a more difficult hand-eye coordination technique for younger students. So what would you do with felting? Well, I've done felting with kids, so you teach, first you have to card the wool, so you get carding combs, which I happen to have. And yeah, I'm really fun at parties. And then you teach them how you lay these different fibers together, but you also teach them about color. So this would be a place where maybe you could bring in Carver's discovery of different pigments and different colors. And we can think of how do we dye these fibers, and what do we do once we have that? Do we dye them before we felt? Do we dye them after? You can do both. So, and after we do these things, maybe with pictures of Carver's poems that relate to these issues up there, you could also then have a follow-up discussion, or a discussion while students are waiting between, say, the carding and the actual felting process. And that discussion could go back to the poems. Could ask students something as simple as, okay, when you read about Carver making this, what did you think of? Now, what do you think of having actually tried to make it yourself? Do you understand why maybe textiles, which today we can buy very cheaply pretty much anywhere, were so important in the 19th century before we had the Industrial Revolution really taking off in the United States? That sort of discussion gives a new meaning to a couple of lines about Carver crocheting, which may just seem like an afterthought to students who have never done it before. Also, it starts engaging them with issues like history, or you could even take it to sort of the implicit gender bending, where we assign certain gendered assumptions with activities like crocheting or lace making, which really were not always there and shouldn't be there now. This is just a craft, same as any other craft. Any other art form, anyone can do it. So, all of these sorts of things are things that you can talk about and deal with to go from the text to the world outside of that text. And here there is a video of how I would sort of introduce it for students, acting like you all are sort of that 8 to 12-year-old group that this book is aimed at. So, think about this, and as you are going forward and creating your own sorts of units based on books and poems leading towards this final project, this is an example that you could use, that you could think about. And think about things that you have encountered in your own life that you could bring in to activities for students.